why we give significantly more investment and more improvement of existing and new international financial institutions, and secondly, why we give significantly more bargaining power to weak states who need bailouts or need development aid from this organization. Before that, in terms of mechanism, what are we talking about? First, we don't say these countries should secede from the WTO or the IMF or the World Bank. We don't think it's a likely scenario because they have influence there, they have long stake investments in those institutions. However, we say they should form separate bodies that will act separately and independently of those institutions and carrying out basically the same functions, meaning things like investing in development aid in Africa, like the World Bank does, forming trade agreements and enforcing them, creating things like investment and relief to states that are facing bankruptcy. If there are any questions, obviously we think that in situations where they are investing in the same country, they'll have sort of coordination between them, but we don't think they'll coordinate to the extent that they have the same plans or they're offering the exact same conditions, and we're going to analyze why in my first point, which I'm going into right now. So, why does it increase investment and improve existing institutions? First, notice bodies are doing very critical work for many places around the world. If it's bailing out countries, if it's development, and so on. In recent years, we're seeing a major decline in investment in those institutions from the West. Why is this the case? We're saying that the economic crisis leads to a situation in which obviously the states still have money to support it, but they prioritize internal needs, they prioritize other needs over it, because this is something that is a constant to them. Its action doesn't, the way it acts and the way it functions doesn't influence them directly or influence their political power. Because, we're saying that what we're doing here is basically a positive arms race. Every country, every institution wants to have influence and wants to have the ability to influence different countries. If you're the one controlling Greece's bailouts, for example, you have a major political control that enables you. You have things like when you're setting the development pace for potential future superpower like Nigeria, you do have a major investment and a major political claim. What we're saying is the likely scenario is that countries want the organization they support to succeed more, which means drawing in significantly more investments. This is a process that fits into itself, right? China, Russia, the BRICS states in general, they wanted them to have power, therefore they invest more. That leads to more Western investment in the WTO, the IMF, and so on. We're saying this leads exactly to the sort of positive competition that increases the ability of these institutions to function. Moreover, the fact that these BRICS countries feel that they are now more represented in this in the new organization, because there is an inherent lack of representation within the Bretton Woods institutions. They're basically very pro-American and represent an American order. We're saying it's a very likely scenario that the BRICS countries are now likely to invest more just by that. Moreover, you have more countries that feel that these institutions don't represent their values. Very major states like Kazakhstan, for example, that has major revenues and is unlikely to invest to that extent in something that promotes democracy or liberal values. We're saying the fact that you can now promote a different organizations means that we have significantly more investments going in. More clarification? No. Moreover, we're saying it's significantly easier to sign things like trade agreements within a smaller block of countries that have similar interests. The fact that certain countries join the new BRICS WTO means that these countries are more able to effectively coordinate new trade deals that increase their economic welfare. Finally, what we get, and also note that states that oppose certain elements of trade deals done by the WTO can now join trade deals for BRICS, which stops them from blocking trade deals that are done within the WTO. Meaning we're getting more diversification on that as well. So finally, we get significantly more investment in very important fields that really that can sometimes save lives and save economies. We're getting significantly more investment and more ability to function. Before we go on, I'll take closing.
So let's pretend these institutions might succeed. Are you going to allow the United States to join them?
We think it's unlikely that BRICS countries will allow the US to join. If they do, they will probably do it in a way in which they are significantly more represented, just like the US does today with China in Bretton Woods institutions. We say there may be coordination between the two organizations, as we said, and generally we say there are quite a lot of partnerships between the United States and China, trade partnerships anyway, so we don't think So let's talk about bargaining power to weaker states. First of all, just think of the example of you taking a loan from a bank. Assuming you only have one bank. Please be quiet, CEO. You're struggling. Let's assume you just have one bank, right? This bank can demand whatever interest it feels like. It can take whatever commissions it feels like on your loan and on your transactions. When you have, we say the exact same thing happens here. When a state takes a loan from the IMF or from the World Bank, countries want to make profit. Countries don't want to invest more than they have to. The likely scenario is they will have harsh conditions. Moreover, this is critical, they often have conditions that, for example, push for certain reforms the countries are simply not ready for. Things like that create public resentment and create actually a situation in which you get changes of governments, and you get the public not cooperating with new economic deals because the states are forced into it too fast. We're saying that when you have two organizations want to go into influence, you have more bargaining power as an individual state. You have bargaining power to get better bailout deals and better development deals if you're those states. We're saying this is critical, first of all, for their sovereignty, but also for them being able to have their input and to have solutions that fit their own societal needs. For example, we say that we don't think these organizations are likely to invest in something that's a completely failed economic model. However, we say they are likely to be more diversified and allowing the country, for example, to take a slower pace in its development if it sees that societal needs require it. If it will lead to more insurgencies or to more people being dissatisfied with the regime. And we're saying we create a better situation that allows for the state's inputs and the international institutions' inputs to create more sustainable development. Extremely proud of the proposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the Prime Minister. Now starting into the opening opposition elected by the leader of the opposition. Yes, yes.
Honorable Speaker, Side government tries to paint a picture in which there are some insignificant problems to IMF and like other international institutions. On our side of the house, we're going to show you how these institutions have much more experience and have changed their tactics from the past to adapt to the current market. Secondly, we're going to talk about how the political leverage creates better outcomes for countries such as countries that ask for aid. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how a common set of rules is good for the world in general. So first of all, just to clarify, I want to talk about what did the IMF, World Bank, and WTO actually do. So the IMF gives like stabilization loans, bailout packages, etc., and they attach certain conditions to them, such as like transition to democracy, things like that. And we think that those are particularly good and are tailored to each country's needs. Secondly, the World Bank provides infrastructure and projects in developing countries, especially in aid. So we think that those things are also contingent upon certain conditions in which they need to meet the infrastructure instead of having corruption and having the cronies take it all. Thirdly, the World Trade Organization makes fair trade rules and common standards across countries so people aren't confused when they trade under like, you know, the South China Sea or something, whether they're allowed to take that trade route or not. So, a couple of points of rebuttal to opening government. The opening government tells us that in their model that these states should not secede. But I don't understand what the actual difference between them and seceding and not seceding is. Because if they're able to get their own institutions, they're less likely to contribute into the current standing institutions, meaning that their representation is going to be significantly that China wants to form its own infrastructure bank, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the AAIB, they have decreased funding to the World Bank to set up their own, which means that they're going to get less representation in these pre-existing institutions. Okay. Moving on to their material. So first of all, they say that they're going to increase their investment because IMF funding has gone down in the past, in the recent decades. So we tell you that actually it has gone up. This is just factually false. Developed countries have realized that developing countries are a key part of their market strategy, and they have active incentives to make sure that they have a good market so that companies can go inside and expand their business there. We think that that is good. Secondly, under this point, they talk about the political claim and that there's like there's an increased representation of BRICS countries on their side of the house. Look, we're willing to reform the Bretton Woods model to make it so that China has more representation in these in the World Bank and IMF, and we think that to include them more will make them more engaged. On their side of the house, they become extremely disengaged. On our side of the house, we show you that the IMF and the World Bank are constantly improving to make sure that they're better. Finally, they say that, look, these countries get increased bargaining and power, and like having one bank in any interest can set up any interest. The IMF, the goal of the IMF is to improve the wealth of the country, and that means that they're not going to set any interest level. Set interest levels that meet their goals. We think that that is pretty clear. Finally, they say, like, look, the input from there's no input from these BRICS countries in the IMF or World Bank. So we tell you that the IMF already tailors each of their bailout packages to each country, and they have an active dialogue with these developing countries so that they can get the best package possible. We think that that is crucially important. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about how the IMF and World Bank are more experienced, have more expertise, and therefore more likely to give better bailout packages and better results. So first of all, we tell you that the IMF and World Bank have tons of experts that have years and years of experience, that have looked through different country profiles, etc., and they have like expertise on these countries. They also have had past mistakes in which they have learned from, and we think that that is something that that these new institutions will never have, right? So for example, we can tell you that in the 90s, there was a Washington consensus in which conditions were placed on bailout packages. However, due to the backlash in the 90s, they have now changed their ways, and they're more happy with things such as infant industry protection and like no harsh austerity measures to pay debt. We think that they have recognized the failures of the past and now are able to improve. Secondly, under this point, because of the experience and expertise, we find that these banks have more stability, meaning that they're not going to disappear at any moment. We think that these BRICS institutions, because they're new, they're likely to dissipate if any country decides to pull out. For example, Russia decides that there's another crisis that they need to face, they need to pull out their money. This aid now just disappears. Because the World Trade Organization, all of these organizations are much more established, we see that they're less likely to pull out, and this aid is going to be more stable. I'll take back half.
The IMF is actually pretty set in its ways and has a history of not changing or learning from its past mistakes. New organizations are more likely to adopt new models and learn from mistakes in the past that have screwed over countries in the developing world.
I just think that that is factually false, right? I have told you the Washington consensus, and they have explicitly changed their policy in this situation. I don't understand why you think that they're never going to change. Okay, so secondly, political leverage. I think that you just get more harms from the BRICS countries than any benefits that you can possibly get. Why is this the case? Because we tell you that BRICS countries are more interested in economic development over anything else, right? So they're more over holistic development, building liberal democracies, etc. This means that they're likely to set either no conditions or bad conditions on these countries that ignore like the existence of human rights abuses, that try to get more votes in the UN. For example, China actively buys out countries in Africa to make sure that they can get more votes in the United Nations, or they're going to fund their allies such as North Korea, which are really unstable, and secondly, aren't probably good for the world when we have like military dictatorships involved. We think on the comparative, though, on our side of the house, the IMF puts in observers, they make sure that the country transitions into a democracy or whatever is suitable for that country, and we think that those Those conditions are much more reasonable, although they're more stringent, they are more reasonable and lead to the long-term development of these countries. Why is it more likely on their side of the house when these new institutions exist that countries are more likely to take that unconditional aid? So first of all, it's much more, they'd rather have no conditions, but secondly, they don't recognize that this is ultimately bad for their development, right? So because they think like, oh, we're just going to take this new aid that is easily, readily available, but secondly, but what if like the new infrastructure bank crashes? What if there's, these conditions aren't actually met? We think that those are particularly bad for these developing countries. For all these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. The leader of opposition to give you the case of the European government, but the two practices.
Two points in my speech. First, what is actually comparative this debate we're going to claim is a currently non-effective bodies which do not know how to allocate the funds, challenging you to get from the open opposition. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why a comparative to a market which will break the monopoly of these bodies is actually better for investments. Firstly, rebuttal. No. The first point about what is the functionality of the body is telling you what they should do, but not how effective they are in doing it actually right now. I'm going to tackle it heavily in my first point. But regarding improving experience, we simply do not care because we don't dismantle these bodies. We're creating alternatives for these bodies. Why does it matter? A, because I'm going to show you that you're actually making them stronger right now as the IMF and the World Bank in my first point. But secondly, note the entire idea of a zero-sum game. They're necessarily going to be defunded. I'm going to show you this is reversed. But moreover, they're going to be likely to publish the reports as they already do. I have read the World Bank report last year. We're going to hire experts in order to make sure they have the current goals. Something is going to happen. But moreover, on a deeper level, note, you should compare it to a world in which the vast majority of states as China are already investing money just without the structure, without any attachment. At any point where political leverage is actually already happening right now without any commitment to an international body because they just do it directly. They tell you why this is bad. Then they say it's going to disappear. China is the second largest economy in the world. Its banks are not likely to immediately disappear. Combined with Russia, Brazil, South Africa, and India, this is not like a bank which is likely to immediately go away. And no, there's even no damage, right? Because if you have invested money and just going to disappear sometimes, it means that you are having money, which is fine as a country that just got its investment and now the bank has defaulted because you have your money there, which that you don't owe anything to anyone. How should we view this debate? They say that they are fine with reforming the current business. This is an analysis and not a policy debate. They cannot just claim this is something which is likely to happen. But note, even if they're going to prove it to you, this is not mutually exclusive. Because if they have the political capital to do that, we're going to show them to do that, but do this as well. But on a deeper level, note, and what is unique and how you should view it. Currently, they are non-functional body. The WTO have failed in its last round of negotiations in order to include the Doha report that actually should have actually updated how terms should be allowed. It means the WTO is actually currently functioning on a set of rules from the 60s because it was ineffective in getting new tradings. Regional trade agreements is happening because of that. Case in point, TTIP, the fact that the EU is in existence and cannot rely on the WTO itself, which is the comparative here, is to a world which is regional on both sides of the house. Regarding the amount of power and the control is very, very limited. There is only 4% of the money in investment which is needed in Africa that is actually currently coming from the World Bank because it is massively funded after the default of the USSR and the fact that there are many crises of economics in the West. I'm going to show you in a minute why more money is actually likely to be allocated through the WTO under our mechanism. And because, note, regarding the regionality, most of the money currently in investments are actually coming from the regional bodies and not from the international bodies right now. The EU is the one that have given most of the money for the Greece bailouts and not the IMF, and this is what is happening all over the world. it is non-functional, and there is not a lot of money there. Why does it matter? Because if they're going to tell you about the importance of international trade agreements and the importance of the resources and liberalization of the West, these are bodies that are currently not achieving these aims. I'm actually going to show you now how we improve them. How does it happen? A, just more money which is going to be invested. How come? A, the fact is, the West is now going to be compelled to give more money to these bodies, right? Because they're going to have a positive arms race. Because if China is going to give more money to international funds, and the West is going to be fearful they're going to lose influence, the West is going to be forced into funding these bodies more, which means more power of liberalization. Secondly, there's just more chance of China and Brazil or in Russia giving money to the new bank because they're going to have more of a control, something which is necessarily not going to happen under one body. They're going to be more able to agree what to do and how to invest this money. But then we say, oh, we're going to lose our capacity of liberalization. Here is a crucial point in this thing. They say that this is a body that should relieve the people who are hungriest in the world. Simply, we do not accept the premise that democracy is something which is necessarily better than other alternatives. Like the people of China have received massive improvements in their lives. There are other alternative models of government which actually can be better. Something which is immediately relevant here is that relieving the people who are the hungriest on the planet and giving them more funding to actually eat and put food on the table is more important. If this is something that we achieve under our side of the house, it is significantly more important than the liberalization force of other democracies. But on a deeper level, note, the fact that you have more bargaining power, they claim on their side of the house that this is something that you have more experience and they just really want to be nice to these bodies. If this is correct, how Greece have actually received its attached bailout from the IMF of the terms of austerity which actually further ruin the country. These are bodies which are forced by huge lobbies within Western countries into a specific model of economics that is detached under their agenda and is currently ruining many economics around the world because they are not negotiating from a position of leverage. So from a position of leverage, which means that when you have a competition, if you're the weakest part, if you're a weak state, you have more of a chance of actually getting a trade which is better suited for you because you now must take under accountability the terms of the weak state. Yes, or
Right, so given that you're not going to put a lot of conditions or a few conditions, how do you stop countries such as Zimbabwe from having Mugabe and people at the very top just absorbing all the development money?
look, if countries as China want to do it now, they can do it in order to gain influence, they can do it without any international body. We simply don't accept this as a comparative in this debate. But the fact is, if they actually want to invest in order to improve the country, the level that Zimbabwe is going to have more of a leverage and you need to compete for its acceptance is something which is going to be more tailored if this is actually your earnest and what you're trying to achieve. And moreover, we're simply not agreeing that giving more money to more Mugabes in the world, that some of it is going to necessarily trickle down to some of the hungriest people in Zimbabwe, is going to be better off for the people that are living there, because a lot of money is going to be just invested in these areas of the world. Note moreover, there are over 30 countries which are not included under the WTO right now. Immediately, right now, if we're going to actually build new bodies, there's going to be an incentive to compete and actually include them within the current structures because you want to gain more influence with the new bodies. If you have a monopoly, if someone is not agreeing to your terms, you have an incentive not to include them at all. Right now, these are the poorest countries on the state which are not considered to these terms which are under aspects. If you're going to have to compete to include them as well, it means that more bodies are going to be, more countries are going to be included that are not regulated at all under a structure of a monopoly. Moreover, they will have an incentive to strike deals. And this is something which is crucial, right? Because they want to strike deals immediately with countries that have more of a trade influence with, which means that more of a dependence with, which means that we win the game. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister. To conclude the opening part, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
we'd rather have continuation of the status quo, where we have the World Bank and the IMF providing all the kinds of benefits that Elizabeth talked about in her speech. I'm going to talk about the comparative in the first part of the speech. Then I'm going to look at what benefits we've heard from their side of the house, these institutions, and respond to them. And then I'm going to talk about all the harms that we showed you of the creation of these institutions and why unbalanced they lay out. And that's why we're in this top half, and ultimately this debate. So let's talk about the comparative first. So firstly, opening government tell us we can still have the World Bank and the IMF. Well, yeah, of course you can, right? The question is, how many people actually use them if you're a developing country? If you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank coming along and saying, oh, we'll build a massive road in your area, no conditions attached, and the IMF is saying, we'll build that road in the area, but we'd rather you protect the human rights of the workers who go there, who are in the process of rule of law and democracy in your country, you're obviously going to take the former, right? Because it's less politically problematic for you to do so, and it's much easier. So all we're saying is that when your institutions exist, the IMF and the World Bank are just used much less. So that's the comparative in this debate. And secondly, on the comparative, he says that China would already fund projects in Africa on our side of the house. Yes, that's true, but on a much smaller scale to your side of the house, right? So on your side of the house, China's got an Asian investment bank, that Abu Dhabi investment, Qatar, and massive investment funds and hedge funds are putting money into, which China then has control over and funds. So the comparative is China spends some money on our side of the house, but you on your side of the house, they get to leverage private investment and lots of money and then pump that on their side of the house, which is problematic. On our side of the house, that private investment would either go into the World Bank, or it would go into the IMF, or it would go into pension funds, or other private investments would feed back into the global economy or into development funds. So in terms of that issue, we think that there's less Chinese influence on our side of the house, and that's a good thing. So let's talk about the benefits we have from their side of the house of these institutions. So firstly, they told us that now the West will spend more because of this positive arms race. No, we think there's a net neutral effect here, right? So when China has an Asian investment bank, or in South Africa is funding less the IMF, so it can fund more the South African development community, they necessarily reduce the amount of money they spend in the IMF. They reduce their commitment to the World Bank because they just transfer that money to their own political projects. They don't have enough political will in their country to say, oh, we're going to keep giving the same amount to the IMF plus lots more to our own new institution. There's no political will for that. People want the money to be spent domestically. No, thank you. So we're seeing a reduction in funding into the World Bank and the IMF because of these new institutions. But we are saying on our side of the house, the IMF has been increasing funding. Countries that continue to use the IMF have been increasing funding. Why? Two reasons. Because firstly, they recognise we live in a globalised world now, where if there's a recession in a developing country, that hurts economies all across the world. And because the globalisation has increased more and more so, the IMF countries have contributed more to the IMF, so they recognise they want to stop those kinds of recessions. No, thank you. And also because the financial crash was so devastating, they recognise we need to improve performance in emerging economies, which often was volatile during the financial crash, and that's why the IMF countries have been increased. So we think in this debate, let's put a net neutral, right? We're not seeing more investment in development, we're seeing probably about the same. It's just been shifted on their side of the house, away from the IMF and the World Bank, into these Chinese programs, into these Indian programs, and why that's so harmful. So no, thank you. Let's talk about trade agreements. They said they get more trade agreements. Look, most trade agreements in the world are bilateral, as in country A with country B. Why is that? Because when there's more than two parties, the complexity increases massively, right? Because you now have party 3's interests to be considered, and they might disagree with party 1 and with party 2. So 85% of all trade is through bilateral agreements. So we say that in terms of maybe you get a few more regional trade agreements from that side of the house, but so much trade is done bilaterally, I think that's very, very moderate. But even if you do get more regional agreements, like the TTIP, there are several problems with regional agreements. What are they? You get a complex mess of vested interests in each particular country. There are 7 or 8, 9 countries, all proposing and lobbying for their one particular thing. So the thing that comes out at the end is this massive mix of bureaucracy and red tape, and all these things were added to satisfy each of the countries. No, thank you. And that can actually worsen the performance of businesses in those economies. They have to adapt all these new regulations and laws, as we've seen in the TTIP, which is why the Democrat Party is so opposed to it, right? It's so complicated, so bureaucratic, and so messy. And the same thing we say about these agreements, they often take 10, 20, 30 years to complete, right? And that can create uncertainty in those countries because businesses don't know what's happening. So even if you do get more multilateral agreements and regional agreements, we're not sure they're that great. Finally, they told us you get more bargaining power when you have an alternative institution to choose from. Right. Firstly, we say we're not sure how important it is you need this extra bargaining power. Why? So Elizabeth tells you the IMF has significantly improved its conduct in recent years. And we use the example of Greece. The IMF has extended maturities on the debt repayment of Greece because they recognise those debt repayments were hurting the economic performance of Greece. They've softened the austerity requirements. They're still requiring austerity, right? But they've softened it. Why? Because the IMF isn't stupid, right? The IMF recognises that if Greece is going to tank completely, that will hurt the world economy. So they've been flexible, they've adapted, they've been gradualist, and they've changed their approach to Greece to help it improve. But what we say is that it's important it's kept those requirements about austerity. Why? Because Greece is not a country that should get a bailout with no conditions. Because if Greece didn't improve its productivity, for example, by changing working hours, increasing the retirement age and so on, its long-term sustainability would be completely destroyed because no one wants to invest in that country. They're going to change their labour market to make it attractive to invest to. So all of those are reasons why we just don't think that we prefer an alternative bailout which would undercut the IMF bailout and offer conditions which are worse.
So here's your false premise. In reality, that the World Bank is a fraction of China's annual GDP. They're likely to continue its investments there in order to maintain its influence over the countries that will accept its terms and have the bodies, which means that they're not mutually exclusive, and all in all, we're going to get more investment and alleviate poverty worldwide.
So China, Russia, Brazil, India all contribute significant amounts to the World Bank, as they do to the IMF. So these are significant countries that have increased their funding, but now they're new institutions, money's going elsewhere, that's false. So I've just given you reasons why I don't think they've really shown as much benefit to the institutions. What if we show you an opening opposition? Multiple harms. We gave you three. We talked about harms of political leverage, the volatility of funding, I'll talk about coordination problems. On political leverage, Down House response was that, well, we should just give them food, right? We shouldn't have conditions attached. Look, on our side of the House, they would accept the IMF deal if there was no alternative, because they recognise they need the money for their country. On our side of the House, they would accept the money and do the things like promote the rule of law and promote democracy and so on. So we are giving them food on our side of the House, but we're just doing it in a way which has human rights conditions attached, improve their livelihoods. And what we say is that for the long-term development of this country, it has to be holistic, right? Just because you build a road in that area, it doesn't mean you've built the school which will necessarily train the workers which will then be there to improve that economy and so on. So they're too short-termist on their side of the House. We're much long-termist in building institutions which the IMF does. In terms of volatility of funding, China's volatile, Russia's volatile, the stock market crashed recently in China, Russia is very oil price dependent. They will cut their funding if that volatility occurs. We're much more stable on our side of the House. Look, at the end of this top half, you have to ask yourself, have they really shown us much benefit these institutions? I don't think so. Have we shown lots of harm to them? Yes, that's why we win.
Thank you very much to the Deputy Leader of the start of the closing part of the debate. Member THS.
Opening opposition characterized the IMF and the World Bank as benevolent institutions that go to the third world and provide for democracy and provide them workers' rights. Mr. Speaker, this is a lie. These are institutions which have a commitment to neoliberalism that ensures not the best conditions for the people of that country, but the best conditions for multinational corporations, and importantly American corporations that want to ensure that they are able to keep their investments there and to make sure that's stable. They do not have the best interest of the people at heart, and we think their interest in the people goes up on our side of the House. We're going to talk about why that competition will be make it more likely that things that the IMF says that it wants to do are likely to happen in terms of workers' rights, things like that. But first, some extraneous points of rebuttal to what we've heard in the previous speakers. So first, we get this idea from Joe that there will just be less investment. But importantly, this just ignores a lot of the analysis that comes out of opening government about competition. Because look, he gives us this little situation whereby, the BRICS organization, whatever it's called, is going to build a road in a country, and they're doing it with no strings attached, whereas the IMF and the World Bank are doing that with strings attached. But importantly, what comes along with those isn't just economic benefits and ties. There is political ties as well. These are products that these countries want. They want the ability to expand their influence into these countries by making economic ties. And so when they'll say, oh, I'll build you this many roads, America will come back and say, no, we want to have that relationship with you that is a zero-sum game. If we have it, the other trading bloc doesn't. And so we'll build you more roads. We'll build you a couple of schools. We'll make sure that the infrastructure goes there in the long term. So importantly, when these two institutions are competing against each other, because they both want market share and political influence in these countries, they are more likely to increase just the net amount of investment that they put in the first place. But importantly, they want to sweeten the deal, right? So they're going to make it better. Secondly, they talked about, oh, but conditions need to be placed on these countries. Conditions need to be placed on countries like Greece that are irresponsible, that are doing things which are making sure that their economies aren't growing. But importantly, notice that this is often a value-based trade-off. Like, what Greece wants to do is, in the short term, to make things better for people who are at the bottom of their socio-economic system, in order to make those people's lives slightly better who are the most vulnerable. Whereas what the IMF wants to do is make things slightly better for everybody else. And importantly, that's a value-based trade-off which should be made by the people of that country and not enforced on them by the IMF for what they want to get. No, thank you. And then finally, they talk about volatility. Like, importantly, volatility is just a factor of investment. Like, the US are volatile investors as well. If a region becomes unstable for them, they'll pull out investment because that's not as good as it was before. If internal conditions can change within America, they'll move it as well. Importantly, even if you buy the claim that Russia and China are more volatile than the US is, which is potentially one that I'm willing to believe, like, importantly, notice that these two institutions are a check upon one another. When Russia and China pull out their investment, that's when the US and other Western nations come in with the IMF and the World Bank and be like, and we'll put in our investment now, because they want to buy that political influence, and this is seen as a competition for them. So the volatility point really falls on our side of the house because the two bodies will check each other anyway. That's how competition works. So first, why is it that the IMF doesn't do the good things that they want to talk about? Because they tell you that it has a commitment to increasing workers' rights and that it has a commitment, no thank you, to increasing democracy and things like that in the country. This isn't true. Firstly, because it's dominated by the US. It was established at the Bretton Woods Convention, which funnily enough was held in the US. But importantly, it's about more than that. Like, the head of the World Bank, I might get this the wrong way around because my partner is informing about this, but apparently the head of the IMF has always been American, and the head of the World Bank has always been a European educated in America. I might have got those two things the wrong way around, but importantly, they're educated at Ivy League colleges whereby they're taught neoliberal economics. They're told the only way the world can be run is by through free market trade, and anything other than that isn't the right economic model. Importantly, like, the IMF's headquarters, or it might be the World Bank, I'm getting the two confused, are in New York and literally staffed almost exclusively by Harvard economists who have this commitment to neoliberal economics. Importantly, A is dominated by the US, and so what they want to do isn't necessarily what's in favor of countries in the third world, but ultimately just what means that their companies can invest more, and so that middle class people in America get better payouts and are therefore more happy. And so they don't do the things that they want to do. Unfortunately, they do things like when they went into Mozambique and took away farmers' subsidies. Those were things that meant a lot to those people and ensured that they would be able to live their lives with some form of money and things like that. And they just simply took that away because that wasn't fertile to the conditions of investment that they wanted. We say that firstly, this just isn't fair, because if it's a value decision that is made by that country to put subsidies in that certain place in order to benefit people who might be uniquely harmed in the way that the US isn't going to recognize. And importantly, they say, oh, but they're going to put in place rights and democracy. No, they're not. What they're going to put in place is people in these governments who are going to cater to their neoliberal aim. People are going to get rid of subsidies. People are going to get rid of tariffs, and in many cases not listen to what the people of that country want to take on.
But those Ivy League trained economists, yes, might have studied in the 1990s, but they've also studied everything that's happened since then, such as the failures of the IMF, and they've adapted.
Okay, so first, notice that people become wedded to their institution and the ways in which that institution works. If you've always worked in the IMF and the World Bank, which has put forward this platform of neoliberal economics, you're unlikely to change, particularly if you are an old person who's been educated in that way. But we also just don't see why our institutions are going to be full of idiots that don't know how an economy works. Clearly there are universities in China. These are people that are going to know how the economy works. They're probably people who've studied the history of the IMF and the World Bank and are likely to take into account that they've done some bad things and not do those bad things. We don't know why they get all the good economists and we get all the B-grade idiots. That's unfair. You're also out of time. But importantly, why does competition change these things? First, as I was talking about, not only do they don't only have economic interest in this area, they have geopolitical interest. They want to maximize security bubbles away from each other. They want to make sure that if there ever was a problem there, that those people would be on their side. Importantly, that means they're going to compete with each other. They're going to offer the best trade deals. They're going to do the least they can to meddle in the government that currently exists there in order that those people get what they want. Why is this important? Like, why do we care? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the IMF is doing things that mean that, like, average people don't get as much money as they get because their government are spending all their money servicing debt instead of paying out welfare payments to make sure that those at the bottom can have the food that they receive. On our side of the house, we have two bodies that compete with each other in order to make sure that they give the most beneficial deals. That means that slightly more people are going to get the types of investment they need so that they can be employed, and slightly more people are going to get things like welfare payments when the IMF doesn't cut them quite as much as it would under the status quo. And because of that, because people's lives get better, I beg you to oppose.
Thank you very much. The member of government start the case for closing opposition. I'd like to invite the member of the opposition.
We agree that the IMF and the World Bank and WTO are not perfect. But from closing opposition, we're going to explain two things which will happen because of the alternatives that make the world, specifically for the most vulnerable developing countries, a worse place. First, that developing countries will lose access to these institutions because of the political pressure that the BRICS will use to stop them from joining, exactly because of the competition that the opening government talked about. Second, we're going to talk about how developing countries lose power in the IMF and the World Bank when the BRICS are no longer have power in those institutions who have some mutual alliance interest. Before that, I want to refute the entire extension of the closing government. They talk about the IMF and the World Bank as sort of a neoliberal hoax. They spent enormous amounts of time on this. This is largely irrelevant. It is about whether the current state of the IMF and the World Bank can actually be changed for the better or worse, not about if it's currently bad or not. So they give us one reason to believe why the current economists can't learn from the past. Because there's this loyalty to the institution. But there's no loyalty to people in a very different institution 50 years ago. They have no those people, they have no sort of connection with them. They're just as different as other institutions in many instances. The last thing they talk, and even further than that, I will explain in extension why the BRICS will lose power in the IMF, and therefore it gets worse, and the IMF only becomes more neoliberal, and all the things which they talked about. Delving into extension. So, why will developing countries lose access to the IMF and the World Bank? So their case relies on competition existing. Emma asks an important POI and says, well, it's very, and asks, are they likely to join each other? They say it's very unlikely. So what does it mean? That means that the IMF and other institutions and the AIB will exist as separate institutions with different actors, and the actors will not be sitting in, for example, both institutions. What does that competition mean? That means when a developing country wants to get help from one of those institutions, we think it's very likely that the BRICS are going to pressure that developing country in choosing between the existing current economic institutions and the new institutions which are created by the BRICS. Why is that the case? Because competition means that you want to do better than the other institution. The AIIB wants to do better than the IMF and the World Bank. That's what their entire case relies on. They can't, for example, ignore that and say that's not true, because then they would be knifing opening government. What does that mean? If you allow a country to both join, for example, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the IMF, then also the other institution who you are in competition with will do just as good as you, because they are also helping that country. They're also getting that contribution in many instances. So what does that mean? That means that you don't gain a competitive advantage by helping another country in those instances. So because you want to do better than the other institution, what are you going to do? You're going to use the political pressure that you have over the developing country, which is very proximate to you, say, you need to choose for the AIIB. You need to choose for the institution that we set up, because we do not want to make the institution we are in competition with much richer. We do not want to make the IMF, for example, get more influence over that developing country because they are in direct competition. What does that look like? The BRICS will pressure those neighboring developing countries. Why are they able to do so? Why will that political pressure work in these instances? First of all, there's economic leverage. Because of the proximity of developing countries to BRICS, they are far more integrated, for example, to things like trade. That means that they have far more leverage over them by saying we're going to pull out trade if you choose that other alternative, if you join the IMF instead of us in many instances. Second of all, there's political leverage because there are very close ties between these countries. Why? Because they often cooperate on a whole set of issues which both affect them in many instances. In that political circumstance, often developing countries rely on the help that the BRICS give in many instances. So therefore, they say, we're not going to politically help you or help you with other crisis situations since we are more powerful and you rely on our money that we have. No, the BRICS are the most powerful institutions within those very regions. So they're in those regions and therefore can abuse that power they have over developing countries. So what does that mean? That means that it will pressure them into not, for example, joining, like losing out on the IMF and World Bank, but instead joining their alternatives which they have set up because of that competition. Why will that not happen under our side of the house? Because there's nothing to lose if they join that other institution, since they don't have their own institution and are not in competition. Them joining another institution means that your own institution doesn't lose out in that instances. It doesn't put your institution, which you have created, on the back foot. So therefore there's no incentive to pressure them in those instances. Why is that specifically bad? We think there are a lot of things and facts we can dispute in this debate, but there's one fact we're fairly sure about. The IMF and the World Bank will have far more money than the new institutions, given that they're joined by far more nations and far more richer nations, and those Western nations, even though the BRICS are developing, are still far richer. So what does that mean? If they lose out on the IMF, they lose out on millions and billions of money, which potentially could be going into helping those people in many instances. Even if that goes through some swanky neoliberal policy, we think more money is better in those instances than having no money at all in many instances. But here's exactly why, even if you believe that neoliberalism doesn't help them, it will get worse. Before I explain exactly that, Dan, go ahead.
Even if we accept the political leverage point, the reality is that only 4% of the World Bank projects are actually funded because of the reasons we have given in our case. More money means the comparative is actually getting no money for your projects at all the developing nations and getting some money that is going to go to the...
Two things. One, I will explain how under comparative actually that becomes better in the IMF in many instances. But second of all, you have given us no reason to believe why those will be significantly different given because of the analysis of closing government of loyalty, which I just refuted in my refutation. So they say the IMF is bad. But here's the alternative. The BRICS will lose influence within the IMF and the World Bank. Why? Currently they have some influence in those institutions. Why? Because there's a certain extent of political will. They are merging developing economies and have become economic powerhouses in many instances. That means they are ultimately likely to become big players on the world stage and are likely to have political influence in the entire world. That means that there's a need to locate them in those economic institutions. So why did they lose that power on the comparative? Because they undermine the very institution of the IMF and the World Bank. They're going to do different policies. That is explicitly what they rely on. They're a threat then to the IMF. So what does that mean? Specifically because of the competition, you're not likely to give them more power within the IMF because you are in competition with them. Giving them power in the IMF directly helps them in many instances. So therefore, you're unlikely to do that. Moreover, there's no political will to help them because they are a threat now to your institution. They're trying to undermine it, and therefore you're less likely to give in. Why is that very problematic? Because we say BRICS and developing countries are not completely similar, but they share some key features in because they're still in the developing phase. For example, they're more likely to be reliant on a single product in many instances. They're far more industrialized than many other Western developing economies. They still have some big industries in some aspects, which they're currently building up, given that they're now currently only relying on one big industry. So that means that the kinds of things like protection, not happening by the IMF, are far more likely to happen under their side of the house at the point where the BRICS lose the current influence they have. Their interests align more with developing countries than the West, and the power which they currently have in order to help those developing countries is lost under their side of the house. They doom the most vulnerable in the developing world. I could not be prouder to oppose.
Thank you to the member of opposition. Now, to conclude the case for the suspension, I'd like to invite
Two points of summation to this speech. Before we get there, let's talk about what we just heard from the previous speaker. So, The first major point that that they brought us is that essentially the BRICS countries will gain more power if they set up their own institutions and will abuse this power over their neighboring developing nations and do a lot of things that aren't good for them, right? Like, first of all, I'm not actually clear on how they believe that countries like China and India will, like, quote unquote, abuse the countries that are beside them, right? Like, clearly, the IMF currently has monopoly, as we've heard from both government teams in today's debate, so they already have like the possibility of abusing these countries and the types of trade terms they demand and that sort of thing, right? But I think what we gave you on closing government is we showed how like the political incentives for BRICS nations exist such that they are incentivized to give better terms to the neighboring countries and not abuse them in order to ensure that these countries continue to rely on like China increasingly in like a geopolitical sense so that China can gain allies, that China can gain more influence, that sort of thing, right? We think that this is clearly already happening as like Chinese investment increases throughout the entire world. It has incentives to actually try to create good economic outcomes for a lot of these nations in order to gain political influence. And what we do is we increase the extent to which they do this because it becomes more formalized and it is done in a way that is competitive to the IMF, right? Next claim we get out of them is that, like, oh, the IMF will always be richer than anything the BRICS countries could ever set up. I am really not sure why, right? Western countries in status quo often have lots of trouble getting budgets from their people to give lots of money to international aid and to these types of organizations, whereas BRICS countries literally do this all the time, right? Like, China is spending billions of dollars throughout the world. South Africa is spending billions of dollars investing in other Southern African nations, right? Like, I just don't believe this on their side of the house. We've shown that you actually get more investment overall because both parties are now incentivized to compete to be the ones to provide debt relief and such other things to these nations. We think we get more dollars on our side of the house. The final claim that they get is that the BRICS will lose power in the IMF and that this is bad, right? Well, first of all, like, I'm not sure that they have that much influence in the IMF in the first place, right? Insofar as, like, China flouts the WTO on a regular basis, like, it doesn't even participate in that legitimate manner in the first place. BRICS nations aren't a huge role in IMF decision-making or World Bank decision-making, as Dan has already told you, right? That's why they're already doing things like setting up the Asian Infrastructure Bank, etc., right? We already showed how what this does is it beefs up the IMF and gives the Western nations who dominate the IMF more incentives to do better things in terms of their aid they're giving around the world. Two questions in this speech. First of all, how this changes development incentives in the developing world, and secondly, why BRICS nations cannot do this through conventional institutions and how it's better when they do it themselves. So first of all, how this changes development incentives in the world. So what we told you is that the United States, by dominating the IMF and the WTO, has been able to influence the economies of developing nations in a wholly self-interested way, right? Opening opposition claims, oh no, they do it for human rights and they do it for democracy, and that's their incentive, right? First of all, I'm not sure that there's actually that much history of this, right? Like, what actually generally happens is they'll say, oh, we have to do this, like, democratically, we have to monitor you, and like the countries pretend to comply for a little bit, but then once they get the money, they simply regress, right? Like, it's not that legitimate. Clearly, the IMF is not actually just incentivized by democracy in the first place, right? Like, also, these countries are just often not ready for democracy in the first place, so this whole process doesn't work. Like, I don't think that the IMF and the WTO are significant bodies to enforce democracy throughout the world, right? Why is this? This is because the United States, who dominates these bodies, does not actually care about democracy and human rights in the world as much as it cares about, like, its geopolitical influence and the power that its multinational corporations have in these countries, right? It cares about, like, increasing these countries' dependency on the U.S. so that when it wants markets for its goods, like, it can demand that these countries accept U.S. goods, or it can stop these countries from having subsidies which protect their burgeoning industries to allow, like, American companies to outcompete them, right? They don't have the economic development of these nations at heart necessarily, and we've seen this time and time again through history, right? What changes, right? We think that BRICS nations do also have some of the same self-interested motivations when they're giving aid, but because BRICS nations have political incentives to combat U.S. influence, they will be more likely to offer terms which are favorable to, say, an African nation which needs investment, or an African nation which needs debt relief, right? And then this also changes the IMF and the World Bank and causes them to not only act in a self-interested manner, to also attempt to give conditions to these countries that are more favorable to them, because the U.S. will want to combat, like, the BRICS influence in the world, right? That's why competition is a better mechanism. Secondly, actually, go ahead, Joe.
So the IMF has increased its funding in recent years in response to globalization, but there is very little political capital to increase it further because development aid is unpopular and politicians rather spend on domestic issues to win votes. So your competition argument is not going to work.
Right, but we think that now when the US sees like that the BRICS nations are posing a bigger threat to them, then the US will be able to get more money from its citizens to go towards international aid. That's why we increase it on our side of the house. So second point, why BRICS nations cannot do this through conventional institutions, right? I think Dan gave you good arguments that went beyond saying the word neoliberal about why these institutions have a history of doing these types of things and why they will continue probably to do so, right? Like, it is commitment to ideology, but it's also nationality, where these people are from and the types of people that they are surrounded with. And it's also a history, right? I actually deny that these people don't have any loyalty to their institutions, right? Like, you join the World Bank by being a certain type of economist. That's how you move up through the ranks, right? Like, so they do have the incentive to keep on doing this. Like, opening opposition's counterclaim was Greece. They're like, Greece is an example of how they're improving and learning, and they didn't impose that harsh term, right? I literally deny this. With Greece, they're still demanding the same structural adjustments that they've been enforcing in Latin America and Africa and forever, right? They set conditions based on what is good for their lenders and their multinational corporations, ignoring the fact that there are Greek people on the ground who suffer as a result of the austerity that they demand, and they cause rampant unemployment in these countries, and that in poorer countries like Africa actually stop the government from spending money on things that are going towards these people and providing essential services, right? Like, the corrupt leaders of African nations who accept help from the IMF go along with it. They're like, it's fine, we'll change our economy, we'll become more neoliberal, because they're benefiting, they're rich, but it actually hurts their people on the ground, right? It stops countries from getting debt haircuts. It stops, it doesn't allow them to maintain subsidies that are helping their industries and creating jobs, and it forces them to cut government programs, right? We don't claim that there should be no conditions on our side of the house, but we say that when you have two bodies which are competing to provide better conditions, you're more likely to get an aid outcome which is better for the economies of these countries because they are not reliant on a single source of development aid. Cannot be more proud to propose.
Thanks a lot to Government Whip. Now, to conclude the debate, I'd like to invite the opposition whip.
We think developing nations should be about the economic policies that will help them best. It shouldn't be about a contest who gets most popular. We think that's something that the proposition is creating. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, the quality of these institutions, why we think they will go down. Then specifically about the developing world, why we think that when China moves out of the IMF and uses less of its influence there, it's very likely that the countries that don't have the power of China will be less well represented. But first, one point about this neoliberal policy from CG. Basically what they run is, we don't think the IMF has the right economic policy. First of all, I'm unclear why China, Brazil, and Russia, who did rather well under the policies of the IMF, would necessarily oppose all these policies of the IMF and would necessarily create completely different policies, right? China got very rich when they moved more towards the policies the IMF proposed. They got lots of their money there. We're unsure why they will change everything when they have their own back. But secondly, they did change, right? For all the people who don't study political economic institutions, the Washington Consensus was presented as the 10 commands of economic development. But the IMF let them go because they didn't work, because they changed, because they developed. Because even though they might went to Harvard, and apparently when you go to Harvard you're really stupid, we think those people have realized that it's not something that worked, right? You can look at data and see that it didn't work. We think that's something that actually happened and changed. I'm unclear why when you go to Harvard you've never heard of different policies than neoliberal policies. We think probably you've also heard about other things. So moving on about the quality of institutions. An opening government basically brings you a very Douglas North kind of idea about the competitions between institutions will get better institutions. Here's the problem. They're not creating competition between institutions. They're creating competitions between organizations. Why? Because the United States is unlikely and unable to join this new Russian investment bank if that turns out to be a better investment bank. The United States is unable to take over these institutions and profit from them as well. What does that mean? First of all, we think the United States has a direct incentive to try to make these institutions less good and less powerful than the IMF. We think they're very unlikely when the IMF or when the BRIC countries say we're going to create a new organization because we think the IMF is incompetent, to say you can still be part of the IMF. We really like you to be part of the IMF and change your institutions, right? We think every time Russia is now going to bring up something that they believe the policies of the IMF should change, they say, go back to your own investment bank, right? You don't have to deal with us. We think that's something that's going to happen on their side of the house. That means it's less likely that Russia, China are going to be able to bring up these changes that have to be made. But secondly, to a certain extent, we think it's going to be mutually exclusive. We think if the United States is unable to join these investment banks, we think that they're going to be very likely to try to make these IMF far more powerful, right? To say to countries, you cannot join these investment banks, we are not going to be able to work with you. Even if they don't use the IMF to do so, right? They can still say, we as the United States think you should not do so. With Germany, if they're unable to join this new investment bank and have power there, it's going to say, if you join this investment bank and move away from us and no longer engage with us, we will no longer engage with you, right? We think that that means, even if it's not explicit, many countries are going to have the feeling that they need to choose either between the IMF or between these new investment banks. Specifically, if they set it up to get more influence themselves, right? We think if the BRIC countries try to get more influence, that's something that they will most likely change. Then, opening government and closing government both kind of run the same thing when they say, we have to change the policy of these horrible IMF countries. Here's the thing, I personally don't believe the IMF and this new investment bank should be like Oprah Winfrey. You get a road, you get a road, you get even more roads, right? That's not how economic policy actually works. Because economic policy sometimes means you have to go through austerity. Why? Because you get huge debts, because you get huge problems in the long term, because countries cannot simply get more and more debt and never pay them back. What's the problem here? When these countries can simply play out these two actors against each other and say, I will not go to you, I will not listen to your institution, I will simply go to another institution, none of these institutions will be able to make the difficult choices that are necessary for economic development, right? We think it's less likely that these institutions are going to be harsh if necessary and if needed. We think that's something that's going to be very problematic for lots of countries. Please sit down. Opening government gives you one more idea, a positive arms race. First, if you put the word positive in front of it, doesn't necessarily mean arms race all of a sudden is a good idea. But how do we think that this is problematic? We think that Brazil, Russia, and the BRICS countries sound very good, right? But here are the economic problems they face. Russia, low oil prices, sanctions, very harsh currently economically. Brazil, huge economic problems, literally protests on the streets today because of these economic process. China, stock market crashes. We think if there is going to be an arms race, that's probably not something these BRICS countries are going to necessarily win, right? However, what they are going to do is they're going to go into this arms race, set up a different institution, try to compete with the United States, lose, and then go back to the IMF, say, sorry, messed up a little bit, right? We don't think that the IMF is then going to listen to them and going to change the institutions and change the things that are necessary. We think that means these countries lose the ability to change institutions. We think that's very bad for those institutions. Why specifically the developing world? We think countries have different incentives and preferences, and we have to get consensus about the policy which benefits most countries most. Notice, Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium have similar preferences and often work together within these huge institutions. We think the same goes for Russia, Nigeria, and Venezuela, to stay in the same area. We think because they have similar incentives around oil, similar incentives about how it feels as a country to be very dependent on one specific thing. Before I explain more about Nigeria, opening half.
Here is where both you and OO miss it today. The comparative for the vast majority of countries is to get the support of neither, because the IMF is not rich enough. We have shown that more money is going to be poured in a non-functional system. 30 countries who are currently not represented in WTO are like to be included. Better deals for the poorest countries. All of us are unengaged with.
Okay, so first of all, I'm unsure what countries will spend more. If Russia is going to set up a different institution to compete with it, we think we're going to take away the money from the IMF and going to spend it on these new countries. Secondly, we think that even if there's slightly more money, it's going to give into projects that aren't necessarily the best projects, but are going to be projects that get you popular. Specifically because they're still not going to be able to fund more than 8% of all the projects. We have to look specifically at what good projects are. They lose the ability to do so because it is about popularity, not about what's best. So, why do we think it's problematic if Nigeria loses their influence? We think that Russia is one of the powerful actors within the IMF. We think that's something that Nigeria needs to be represented very well. They depend on Russia to get along and form a bloc together. Nigeria loses that ability if Russia loses the ability to influence these institutions, and that means Nigeria is fucked over. And we think that's very problematic. Ladies and gentlemen, we think the IMF shouldn't be like Oprah Winfrey. Please oppose.